The summer air of 1995 in suburban Ohio was heavy with the smell of funnel cakes and the echo of laughter drifting from the 4th of July carnival, a place where families gathered under strings of lights and the crackle of fireworks bursting above. Ethan and Emily Johnson, just 10 years old, clutched tickets in their small hands as they followed their father, Mark Johnson, through the crowded fairgrounds, their eyes wide with the wonder of rides, cotton candy, and the noisy swirl of voices. To those who saw them, they looked like any ordinary family enjoying the holiday, though there was an edge to Mark's demeanor, a stiffness in his smile, and a distracted way he glanced over his shoulder as though preoccupied with something far from the festivity. Their mother, Deborah Johnson, stayed behind at the family's home, preparing lemonade and setting out sparklers in the yard, expecting her children to return flushed with excitement to tell her about the fireworks and the Ferris wheel. When the clock ticked later into the night and the sound of fireworks faded into silence, Deborah grew uneasy, checking the street every few minutes, the neighborhood quiet but for the occasional crackle of a stray firecracker. Hours later, Mark finally returned, his clothes smelling faintly of smoke and beer, his expression unreadable. He came through the door alone, his shoulders slouched, muttering that Ethan and Emily had run off into the crowd during the fireworks, lost in the press of bodies before he could stop them. His explanation was thin, his words halting, and Deborah felt her chest tighten with a dread that words could not dispel. Neighbors soon filled the streets with flashlights, calling out the twins' names, their voices straining against the empty night, while police combed the carnival grounds, their radios crackling with urgency. Helicopters circled above. Search dogs tracked scents through damp grass. And still there was nothing. No trace of Ethan and Emily beyond the carnival rides, now darkened and abandoned. The town was swept with panic as flyers were printed and tacked to every pole, and Deborah's face appeared pale and hollow in every photograph taken by the press that swarmed her front lawn. Each night she sat on the porch with the porch light burning, refusing to sleep, listening for the sound of small footsteps on the gravel, praying for the sight of her children walking up the path. But the days turned into weeks, and the weeks turned into months, and despite every exhaustive search and every desperate plea, Ethan and Emily Johnson were never found. By the year 1997, the case of the missing Johnson twins had already withered into the cruel category of a cold case, a file shoved to the back of dusty shelves in the police department, its pages stained with coffee rings and weary fingerprints of detectives who once believed they could crack it, but now had nothing left to offer. The carnival where Ethan and Emily Johnson were last seen had long since been scrubbed of clues, its midway torn down and rebuilt into an empty parking lot, the smell of popcorn and gunpowder smoke, replaced with the silence of weeds growing through cracks in asphalt. Deborah Johnson sat most nights at her kitchen table beneath the dim yellow light, her eyes fixed on the wall where the twins' school portraits hung, their identical smiles frozen in time, mocking the hollow years stretching before her. Her husband Mark, once so confident in his tale that the children had simply run off, grew defensive and evasive under repeated questioning, his words stumbling when detectives caught him in contradictions about the night of the carnival. Yet, no charges ever came. The lack of evidence was a wound that festered, allowing him to walk free while Deborah felt like a prisoner in her own home, trapped in the loop of that single night. Their marriage fractured beyond repair, each argument like glass shattering across the floor, until Deborah finally filed for divorce, her signature trembling on the papers as if signing away not just a husband, but the last pretense of normal life. Reporters eventually stopped calling, neighbors stopped whispering, but Deborah continued to move through her days like a ghost, a mother with arms perpetually empty. The twins' backpacks still lay where they had been tossed in the hallway on the afternoon of July 4th. Ethan's with a frayed baseball patch, stitched by his grandmother, Emily's with a dangling keychain shaped like a rabbit. Both covered now with a thin film of dust that Deborah could never bring herself to wipe away. She sometimes sat cross-legged on the carpet near them, fingers tracing the outlines as though touch could bridge the decades, and whispered their names as if saying them aloud might conjure the children back. The sound of silence in the house was a weight she carried everywhere, heavier than grief itself. And though police had filed the case away, Deborah carried it in her chest like an unhealed fracture, every breath reminding her that somewhere in the world her children had vanished, and no one seemed willing to keep looking. The whispers began almost immediately after the search for Ethan and Emily. Johnson went cold, winding their way through church pews, grocery store aisles, and neighborhood fences like an invisible current that everyone could feel, but no one dared speak aloud too loudly, for fear of sounding cruel. People remembered seeing Mark Johnson at the carnival that night, how his answers to reporters never seemed quite the same, how his eyes shifted when he was pressed about the last moment he saw his children, and the murmurs grew with each inconsistency until suspicion clung to him like a shadow that never loosened its grip. Yet suspicion alone was never enough. And without bodies or physical evidence, the prosecutor's hands were tied, leaving the case in a purgatory of half-believed stories and missing pieces that could never be fit together. Some neighbors claimed they heard raised voices in the Johnson house in the weeks leading up to the disappearance. Others swore they saw Mark arguing with Ethan near the carnival rides before the fireworks began, but none of it was written down in official reports, lost in the fog of a botched investigation and the passage of time. Deborah, who had once believed her husband, despite her doubts, found herself staring at him across the dinner table in those final weeks before their divorce, wondering if she had been living beside a stranger all along. The silence between them heavier than any shouted accusation. When Mark remarried within a year, moving to another town with a new wife, the whispers turned into sharp words. The community quietly branding him as a man who could walk away from 2 missing children and build a fresh life without ever looking back. For Deborah, those whispers cut both ways. For though they pointed to Mark, they also painted her as the woman too blind to see the truth or too broken to move on, leaving her caught in the limbo of unanswered questions and cruel judgments. She remained in the family home with the twins' bedrooms preserved exactly as they had been, the wallpaper faded but untouched, the toys lined up on shelves like small monuments to a past that had been stolen. Each time she stepped outside, she could feel the eyes on her, sympathetic but distant, pitying yet doubtful, and she learned to live with the unspoken verdicts of neighbors who thought they knew more than they did. In the quiet of night, she replayed every detail, every smile, every word from her children, and wondered if she would ever learn the truth, or if the truth had been walking beside her all along, disguised as a husband, now gone. Time moved forward for the world, but for Deborah Johnson it seemed to halt in the year 1995, the moment her children's laughter faded into silence, leaving her trapped in a life that felt more like a museum of grief than a home. By the time 2 full decades had passed, she was in her late 60s, her hair streaked with silver and her face lined with years of sleepless nights. Yet she still lived in the same modest Ohio house, where Ethan and Emily's shoes remained by the door, and their bedrooms were kept exactly as they had been, the beds made with their favorite patterned sheets, the posters curling on the walls, and the toys collecting dust but never touched, as though any alteration would erase them further from existence. Each morning Deborah brewed coffee and sat at the kitchen table, staring at the empty chairs, and each evening she checked the porch light before bed, unwilling to extinguish the beacon that had burned every night since their disappearance, a ritual of hope she could not abandon. The annual memorial vigils became her lifeline, moments where candles flickered against the night sky, names were whispered into the cool air, and she felt the fragile comfort of others who refused to let the twins be forgotten. Though after so many years fewer people attended, their lives having shifted forward while hers remained locked in place. In the solitude of her home, the dreams came, vivid and relentless, where she heard Ethan and Emily calling her name from somewhere distant, their voices small but urgent, echoing through the dark corridors of her sleep, until she woke with tears soaking her pillow and the sound of their laughter fading like mist. She told herself these dreams were a mother's heart refusing to let go. But sometimes she wondered if they were something more, a connection across whatever divide separated them now, a reminder that they were still out there waiting. Deborah often walked through the house at night, pausing at the threshold of each bedroom, whispering prayers into the stillness, and though her friends encouraged her to move, to sell the house and find peace elsewhere, she never could, because to leave would be to admit they were never coming home. The calendar pages turned, presidents changed, technology advanced, but inside Deborah's world it was always 1995, her life caught in a loop of grief and fragile hope, every day a testament to the children whose voices she still longed to hear. The fluorescent lights of the Cleveland grocery store hummed faintly overhead as Deborah Johnson placed a carton of milk and a loaf of bread on the conveyor belt, her movements slow, practiced, the kind of rhythm that comes with years of living alone. She was 70 years old now, her once dark hair faded to silver, her posture slightly stooped, yet her eyes remained sharp, searching the world around her with the lingering hope of a mother who had never stopped looking. As she reached for her purse, she noticed the man ahead of her in line, tall and lean, with features that made her breath catch in her throat. His eyes were a brilliant green, so strikingly familiar that Deborah felt the ground tilt beneath her feet, for they were the same shade Ethan's had been, the exact color she remembered staring into when he had begged her for another ride on the Ferris wheel that final night in 1995. Before she could steady herself, her gaze shifted to the woman standing beside him, her hair the same chestnut brown Emily once had, her chin tilted in a way Deborah had seen 1,000 times in photographs. The resemblance was undeniable, so uncanny that Deborah's fingers trembled as she clutched the strap of her handbag, her pulse racing in her ears. They were in their late 30s now, the age Ethan and Emily would have been if they had survived. And though logic screamed that this could not be, her heart told her otherwise with a certainty that nearly brought her to her knees. She froze in place, afraid to blink, terrified that if she moved or called out, they would vanish like the fragile shadows of a dream. The man turned slightly, handing a credit card to the cashier, and for one fleeting second, Deborah saw his profile, the slope of his nose, the curve of his jaw, all pieces of a face she had kissed goodnight countless times before. The woman laughed at something he muttered, and the sound, light and melodic, pierced Deborah's chest like a blade, because it carried the same cadence as Emily's laughter, a sound she had thought lost to time. Her throat constricted, words trapped beneath the weight of disbelief and longing, and she stood frozen as the pair collected their groceries and walked briskly toward the exit. By the time she stumbled after them, heart pounding, they were gone into the Cleveland streets, leaving Deborah clutching her bag in the checkout line, utterly convinced she had just looked upon her children for the first time in 30 years. Deborah rushed through the automatic doors of the grocery store into the gray Cleveland afternoon, her heart slamming against her ribs as her eyes darted across the parking lot, searching desperately for the man and woman whose faces had ripped open 30 years of buried grief. But the lot was already thinning, engines starting, carts rattling, and when she turned the corner, they were gone, swallowed into the endless city streets, as if they had been no more than phantoms conjured by her weary mind. Shaking, she clutched her purse tighter and stood there for several minutes in the cool air, her breath uneven, her pulse refusing to calm. That night, she sat at her kitchen table with the worn photograph album spread open before her, the yellowed pages holding the frozen smiles of Ethan and Emily Johnson, their fourth-grade portraits staring back with innocence, untarnished by the cruel fate that had stolen them. With trembling hands, Deborah picked up a pencil and began sketching. The lines hesitant at first, then growing firmer as she captured the curve of a jaw, the angle of a nose, the unmistakable green of a boy's eyes, and the familiar softness in a girl's expression that mirrored Emily's so precisely it made her chest ache. When she compared her sketch to the old photographs, her breath caught in disbelief, for the resemblance was undeniable, a mirror of time that confirmed what her heart already knew. Sleep eluded her entirely, the hours dragging until dawn as she stared at the images, whispering her children's names into the silence, praying she was not losing her mind. By morning, her resolve hardened, and she drove to the precinct where Detective Maria Jennings, a woman seasoned by years of unsolved files, sat behind a cluttered desk. Jennings listened as Deborah poured out her story, her words spilling faster than she could shape them, her hands clutching the sketch and photos like fragile relics. The detective studied them with a frown, skepticism in her gaze, but also a flicker of something else, something cautious and curious. "It's been 30 years, Mrs. Johnson," Jennings said, her voice measured. Yet Deborah caught the hesitation, the careful pause of someone weighing the impossible. After a long silence, Jennings finally exhaled and agreed to dust off the case file, reopening the investigation with a reluctance that spoke of both weariness and an unwilling hope. For the first time in decades, the possibility of answers had returned. Detective Maria Jennings sat hunched over the faded case file, its cover cracked and frayed from decades of neglect, and as she sifted through its brittle pages, she felt the weight of years pressing down like a fog that refused to lift. The disappearance of Ethan and Emily Johnson in 1995 had long ago been relegated to the unsolved archives, yet as she traced her finger across the chain of custody for witness statements, her eyes narrowed on a peculiar detail, a set of files signed out by none other than Mark Johnson, the twins' father, never to be returned. The discovery gnawed at her, unsettling and strange, for parents were never granted that kind of access. And yet his signature was there, bold and undeniable, a quiet theft of evidence that had remained unnoticed for 30 years. Curious and wary, Jennings dug further into his life, finding that Mark was now 72 years old, living quietly in a weathered cabin 2 towns over, the structure tucked deep in a stretch of forest, as if hidden from the eyes of the world. His second wife, whom he had married soon after his divorce from Deborah, had passed away several years ago, leaving him a solitary figure, a man with no children in his care, no public appearances, and no record of ever speaking about the twins since the night he claimed they vanished. The neighbors she contacted described him as reclusive, a man who rarely came into town except for groceries and supplies, his demeanor curt, his past a subject no one dared raise. Jennings studied photographs of him taken recently by property records, and though his hair was now thin and white, his eyes still held that guarded look, a stare that avoided rather than met. She thought of Deborah's exhausted face, her trembling hands clutching sketches of the grown children she believed she had seen, and the puzzle pieces began to scrape together in Jennings' mind, jagged and incomplete, but impossible to ignore. The missing witness statements stood out like a wound left festering, raising questions about what those testimonies might have contained. What inconvenient truths Mark had sought to bury before they ever reached the hands of prosecutors. Jennings felt a chill as she leaned back in her chair, realizing that while the world had moved on and written the twins' fate as unsolved, the man at the center of it all had been quietly shaping the silence for decades. his presence lingering like smoke that never dissipated, hiding in plain sight while the truth lay waiting. The carnival grounds that had once been alive with flashing lights and the laughter of children now sat abandoned, a barren stretch of cracked asphalt where weeds pushed stubbornly through the concrete, as if reclaiming the land from the ghosts of the past. Deborah Johnson walked slowly across the empty lot in the spring of 2025, her steps echoing in the silence where once Ethan and Emily had darted excitedly between rides, their voices swallowed now by memory and loss. The scent of fried dough and popcorn was long gone, replaced with the faint must of decay and rain-soaked earth. But Deborah could still see it clearly in her mind, the night sky lit by bursts of fireworks, while Mark insisted that she stay home and let him take the children on his own. She had not questioned him then, trusting the man she thought she knew. But standing here 30 years later, the memory churned uneasily inside her, a detail that seemed far less innocent with the sharp edge of hindsight. She remembered the way his voice had sounded when he left the house, tight and impatient, a hint of something she could not name at the time but now recognized as desperation, perhaps even anger, hidden beneath his words. In those first weeks after the twins vanished, several neighbors had quietly come forward to her, whispering that they had seen Mark in the parking lot with Ethan and Emily just before the fireworks began, his posture tense, his voice raised as if scolding them. But somehow, those testimonies had never made their way into the official reports. Deborah had been too consumed with grief then to question why, her energy devoted entirely to searching fields and riversides, handing out flyers, begging for answers from anyone who might have seen her children. Now she wondered if Mark himself had intervened, if he had silenced the accounts before they could ever reach investigators, just as he had signed out those missing files that Detective Jennings had uncovered. The silence around her pressed heavy, and she felt the faintest tremor of fear, even as the wind carried the distant sound of traffic from the highway. She paused at the spot where the Ferris wheel had once loomed, remembering Ethan tugging at her sleeve that morning, pleading to ride it again, his green eyes shining with anticipation, and the image tore through her with brutal force. Standing there, Deborah realized the carnival had never truly been a place of joy in her memory, but rather a place where shadows had begun to stretch long across her life, where her trust in Mark had turned into a prison of questions, and where the last sight of her children had dissolved into the night sky. The cemetery was quiet in the pale light of early evening, the air cool and damp with the scent of cut grass and rain-soaked soil, and Deborah Johnson moved slowly along the gravel path toward the family plot where her parents rested, a bouquet of lilies cradled in her hands. She had walked this path countless times before, but on this particular visit in the spring of 2025, her steps faltered as her eyes caught sight of two figures a few rows ahead, a man and a woman kneeling before an unmarked grave. Even at a distance, something about them gripped her chest with icy recognition, for she had seen them once before in the grocery store, and now, standing in the hush of the cemetery, the resemblance to Ethan and Emily in their youth seemed even stronger, as though 30 years had passed in body, but not in the small details of their faces. The man's shoulders were broad, his green eyes catching the faint shimmer of the setting sun, while the woman's features carried that same familiar softness, her profile so achingly similar to Emily's that Deborah's knees nearly buckled beneath her. She paused behind a tree, her heart hammering, afraid that approaching too quickly might scatter them like startled deer. But when she stepped forward and called softly, "Excuse me," the reaction was immediate. They turned, startled, exchanged a hurried glance, and then walked swiftly toward the exit gate, their pace quickening as if her presence was a threat. Deborah's voice caught in her throat, the words she had meant to speak drowned in the rush of panic that they might vanish again, and she stood helpless as they slipped out of sight, leaving the grave and the silence behind them. Her hands shook as she fumbled in her purse for her phone, desperate not to lose them a second time, and though her vision blurred with tears, she managed to lift the camera and capture two grainy images from a distance, the outlines of their faces and their bodies etched against the grey stone markers around them. She stood there long after they had gone, clutching the phone as if it were the most precious artifact she had ever held, for within those shaky photographs lay proof that she had not imagined them, that her children might still live. Though her pulse still raced, a calm certainty began to settle inside her, a fragile flame of conviction that she was closer than she had been in 30 years. Detective Maria Jennings sat in her office with the hum of the computer, casting a pale glow across her face. Her eyes fixed on the grainy photographs Deborah Johnson had managed to capture at the cemetery, and when the facial recognition software returned results, the names that appeared on the screen made her lean back in her chair with a sharp intake of breath. Evan Brooks and Emma Brooks, both 38 years old, their records beginning in 1996 under sealed adoption files. Their histories fragmented, as though carefully erased and rewritten by unseen hands. Raised in foster care, their trail was marked by moves from one placement to another, until eventually they had surfaced as adults, living quiet, ordinary lives, far from the chaos of Deborah's grief. For Deborah, the revelation struck like a lightning bolt, her heart pounding so violently she thought she might faint. For though the names were different, the ages and the faces aligned so perfectly with Ethan and Emily that her body shook with the certainty of recognition. Jennings approached them formally, her badge lending weight to the questions, but the meeting was met with resistance. The siblings' polite but firm denials falling like cold water over Deborah's desperate hope. Evan's voice was steady as he told the detective that they did not know Deborah, that she must be mistaken. And Emma's eyes, though flickering with something unreadable, remained fixed on the floor as she murmured that they had no connection to the woman who claimed to be their mother. DNA testing was requested as standard procedure, but the tension in the room was thick. Deborah sitting across from them with her hands trembling in her lap, her eyes searching their faces for some crack in the wall of denial. She saw the green of Ethan's eyes in Evan's gaze, the tilt of Emily's chin in Emma's profile, and every fiber of her being screamed that these were her children, yet their words pushed her back into the pit of doubt she had lived in for 30 years. The silence that followed their denial pressed on her chest like a weight, but when Jennings assured her that DNA would bring clarity, Deborah clung to that thread, whispering prayers into the stillness that truth would not betray her again. She walked away from the station with her pulse racing, the photograph clutched in her hand, wondering if she was chasing ghosts or finally standing on the edge of revelation. The interrogation room was stark and suffocating, the hum of the overhead light casting shadows across the table where Mark Johnson sat, his hands trembling slightly, though he tried to mask it with folded arms and a hardened stare, the same stare that had silenced Deborah for years. Detective Maria Jennings leaned forward with the weight of 3 decades, pressing into her voice as she laid down the photographs, the adoption records, the sealed files that had finally surfaced, and when Mark's eyes flickered over them, something inside him seemed to crumble. At first, he deflected with the same rehearsed lines he had used in 1995, insisting the twins had slipped away into the crowd at the carnival, his tone brittle, defensive, and hollow, but the walls he had built began to splinter under the relentless quiet of Jennings's questions, each one driving deeper than the last. The silence between them grew unbearable until his composure cracked and he pressed his palms against his face, his voice breaking as he admitted what Deborah had feared for 30 years but had never been able to prove. He confessed that the disappearance had been staged, not a tragic accident but a calculated act born of spite, a plan conceived in the bitterness of a custody battle he was losing, the night at the carnival merely a curtain to hide his betrayal. He revealed that he had turned to men who operated in the shadows, men who offered underground adoption networks for desperate or corrupt parents, and with money exchanged and lies told, Ethan and Emily were taken, their names changed, their lives rewritten, and Mark walked back into his home that night alone. He admitted he had poisoned their memories before they were handed off, whispering that their mother had abandoned them, that Deborah had chosen a life without them, words meant to sever ties and leave scars deeper than absence alone. His motive spilled from him with venom and tears, not love, not fear, but punishment. Vengeance against a wife who had dared to threaten leaving him, a woman whose strength he had sought to break by taking from her the only thing she could not live without. Jennings listened, her face unreadable as the truth spilled into the air, each word heavy with decades of pain. And though Mark tried to justify his cruelty, his voice collapsed into silence, leaving only the weight of his confession echoing in the room like a final nail in a coffin long waiting to be sealed. At first, Evan and Emma Brooks sat in stony silence when Detective Jennings presented them with the confession, their eyes cold, their jaws clenched, their denial a shield forged over decades of believing themselves to be children abandoned and forgotten. Yet beneath the surface, something fragile stirred, like a thread unraveling from a tightly wound knot. They insisted that their father was a man named Gerald Brooks, a kind but distant presence who had raised them in fractured foster homes, and that their childhood was a patchwork of instability and survival. But as Jennings laid out details that only Mark Johnson could have provided, the cracks began to show. It started with Emma, her hand trembling as she admitted that sometimes in dreams she saw a stuffed bear, soft and worn, left behind on a carnival bench beneath the glow of fireworks, a bear she remembered clutching until a rough hand pulled her away. Evan's defenses broke when he recalled flashes of a car ride, the interior dark, Ethan's small voice sobbing in fear, Mark's harsh tone filling the air with anger, a memory he had never dared to voice but had carried like a phantom ache for years. The fragments were jagged and incomplete, yet as Jennings described Deborah's testimony, as photographs of the twins' belongings were placed in front of them, the puzzle began to take shape, aligning not with the stories they had been told, but with the truth that had been buried from them. Slowly, painfully, they recognized that the life they had known, the names they had carried, had been built on lies crafted by a father who sought to erase their mother from their hearts. Emma whispered that she remembered a woman's voice singing softly at night, a lullaby that did not match the foster homes she grew up in. And when Deborah's voice quivered as she hummed the tune, Emma broke down, her tears spilling like a flood she could no longer hold back. Evan stared at the photographs of Ethan and Emily, the mirror of his own face staring back at him in a fourth-grade school portrait, and his breath caught as the last of his denial slipped away. In that moment, both siblings understood that their childhood had been stolen, their identities reshaped by cruelty. And as they looked at Deborah, her eyes brimming with equal parts sorrow and hope, they realized that the lie they had lived under for 30 years was crumbling, and the truth, no matter how painful, was theirs to finally claim. The arrest came swiftly once Mark Johnson's confession was transcribed, the charges of kidnapping, obstruction of justice, and perjury falling upon him like a gavel that had been waiting to strike for 30 long years. And when the news broke, it rippled across Ohio with the force of a storm. Headlines splashing his name across television screens and newspapers that had once printed the faces of Ethan and Emily under the haunting word, missing. For a community that had whispered suspicions since 1995. The confirmation of guilt was both vindication and agony, reopening wounds that had scabbed over but never truly healed, stirring old neighbors to remember how they had once searched fields with flashlights, how they had prayed on porches with Deborah, and how doubt had lingered like smoke long after the case went cold. Outside the courthouse, cameras clustered in tight packs, reporters shouting questions as Mark was led in handcuffs through the doors. His once proud shoulders hunched, his face pale and sagging, no longer the man who had carried balloons through a carnival crowd, but a frail, defeated figure clinging to silence. Deborah sat in the gallery during the arraignment, her body trembling with the gravity of the moment, her eyes fixed on him with the piercing focus of a woman who had waited half her life to stare down the man who had stolen everything. Mark avoided her gaze, his eyes darting to the floor, to the lawyers at his side, anywhere but toward the mother of the children he had ripped away, his cowardice as visible now as the wrinkles carved deep into his skin. The judge read the charges aloud, each word reverberating in the chamber, and Deborah felt them land like hammer blows on the walls of her heart, each syllable both punishment and reminder of all that could never be restored. She clutched the edge of the bench, her knuckles white, her mind flickering with images of Ethan and Emily laughing in the yard, running through sprinklers, their voices silenced by the cruelty of the man who sat only feet away. The community filled the room with murmurs, some weeping openly, others shaking their heads in disbelief that justice had finally caught up after decades of shadows and silence. Deborah did not cry. Not then, for her tears had been spent long ago. Instead, she sat tall, her presence itself an unspoken verdict, her gaze burning with the truth that he could no longer escape. Watching as the man who once held her family together now unraveled before the world. The meeting took place in a small community center room arranged by Detective Jennings, the kind of place where folding chairs scraped against linoleum and the smell of stale coffee clung to the air, a setting so ordinary that it felt jarringly inadequate for what was about to unfold. Deborah Johnson sat at one end of the table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap to stop them from shaking, her eyes fixed on the door, as she waited for the children she had not seen since 1995 to walk in as adults carrying the weight of decades stolen from them. When Evan and Emma entered, their hesitation was palpable, their steps cautious, their faces guarded, and for a long, breathless moment, the room was nothing but silence, each of them searching the other's faces for pieces of recognition, fragments of memory that time had not completely erased. The first words were strained, Emma's voice sharp as she demanded to know how her mother could have allowed such a fate to befall them, her tone thick with hurt and anger, and Evan echoed her frustration, his green eyes filled with betrayal as he spoke of an entire life built on lies, a name that was never theirs, and a truth that had been denied them until now. Deborah wept openly, her voice trembling as she pleaded with them to believe that she had never stopped searching, that she had fought against silence and suspicion, that every candle she lit and every vigil she attended had been for them, not for the community's comfort, but for her own unyielding faith that they were alive somewhere. The twins exchanged glances, their anger raw but laced with confusion, as though their memories were colliding with new truths they had not yet learned to accept, and for a time the room was filled with more pain than reconciliation, more questions than answers. Still, when Emma's tears finally spilled and Evan's voice broke as he whispered that he remembered the lullaby, the same one Deborah had hummed only days before, something fragile shifted. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the faint glimmer of recognition that tied them together despite everything. Deborah reached out her trembling hand across the table, and though neither child took it, neither pulled away. The gesture lingered in the air like a fragile bridge. When they left, no embrace sealed the moment, but neither did anger. And as the door closed behind them, Deborah felt the faint stirrings of hope that what had been broken beyond measure might one day find its way toward healing, even if the scars would remain forever. The night of the vigil arrived heavy with memory, the air thick with the scent of summer grass, and the low murmur of a crowd gathered beneath a canopy of stars. 30 years to the day since Ethan and Emily Johnson had vanished from the 4th of July Carnival in 1995. The community park was filled with familiar faces, older now, lined with age. Yet their hands still clutched candles the way they had in those first desperate nights, when hope was all they had to offer. Deborah Johnson stood at the podium for the first time in 3 decades. Her body frail, but her voice steadied by the weight of what she carried, her silver hair catching the glow of the candlelight as she looked out over the faces of those who had searched fields and forests for her children all those years ago. She told them, with a trembling breath, that Ethan and Emily were alive, that the children they had prayed for had not been taken by death but stolen into new identities, and though their names had changed and their paths had diverged, they were here still, standing in the shadows of the very community that had mourned them. Her words were both devastating and liberating, for they spoke of unimaginable betrayal, yet also of survival. The truth piercing through the silence that had blanketed their absence for so long. She admitted the road ahead would not be easy. That healing was a journey marked with scars that could never fade. But she wanted them to know the truth, to no longer whisper of mysteries or speculate about what had happened. As she spoke, her voice breaking but resolute, 2 figures stood behind her, silent and still, Evan and Emma Brooks, the names they had carried for decades, but in the flicker of candlelight, their resemblance to the children in the photographs was unmistakable. They did not speak, they did not need to, for their presence alone was enough to still the crowd, to let the truth settle over the night like a long-awaited dawn. The flames of the candles swayed gently in the breeze, tiny stars against the darkness, and for the first time in 30 years Deborah felt something shift inside her. Not closure, for such a thing could never exist, but a fragile beginning stitched to the past, a future built not from what was lost, but from what had been found.